Matt Meselson is professor of molecular and cellular biology at Harvard University and has for many years worked to strengthen the prohibition against both chemical and biological weapons. We asked Professor Meselson to comment on how scientific and technological developments in the natural sciences may have implications for the development of weapons in the coming decades. Professor Meselson, you've said that every major technology has been used for both peaceful purposes but also for malign purposes. Would you like to say a few words about the implications of the revolution in biotechnology for the development of weapons, and how international controls and prohibitions may be strengthened so as to minimize the risks posed by such scientific and technological developments in future?
When we think about the problem of chemical and biological weapons, we could look at the near future or the more distant future. Most of the concern of states and even of scholars has been on the more near future. But it's worthwhile to look farther ahead as well. And when we do that, we see that every technology that our species has ever developed, beginning with metallurgy, Bronze Age, or earlier, right on up to today, has been used not only for peaceful purposes, but also very energetically for hostile purposes, mainly in modern times by states, and usually by great or leading advanced states. I think that's undeniable. It's just a fact. The second fact is that a great technology is now just beginning. It's biotechnology. We have yet to see its full development. It will be certainly accelerating within the lifetime of everybody alive today. And eventually it will give us the ability to manipulate all of the life processes, including behavior, including cognition, how we think, including heredity, what heredity we pass on to the next generation. So these two facts, the fact that all technologies have been exploited both for good and for ill, and the fact that a great new technology, one that allows us to do things completely different from the previous technologies. The old ones could constrain people, they could kill people, as well as doing many good things, but biotechnology has the capability of changing people, changing what it means to be human, affecting behavior, affecting cognition, even maybe, well, I won't say maybe, even for sure, eventually, heredity. Now, what these facts mean, how history will proceed, you'd have to have a high-quality crystal ball to know. But we have only one species. We don't get two of them and decide which course we'd like history to follow. It will follow a course that it will follow, and it will depend on the actions that we take today. And in particular, the actions of great states. I think that individual terrorists or misanthropes, they can cause a lot of trouble, but they cannot affect the course of history except what they may provoke great states to do. It's great states and great ideas that really mold the course of history. So we have to ask, do we think that there is a serious risk out there from the hostile application of biotechnology? And if you think there is, then you have to try to find a way to accomplish something that has never been done before, which is to prevent a major technology from being used for hostile purposes. So we need to think, in a sense, outside the box. Little measures won't make any difference. We need big measures. Well, fortunately, there is a general human disinclination to use alterations of life processes for hostile purposes, that is, poison and disease. There's a taboo. Is it strong enough in and of itself? Almost certainly not. After all, we saw in World War I the massive use of poison gas. We saw during the Cold War the massive preparation on both sides for continent-wide biological warfare. Nevertheless, there were restraints, and these restraints are what we have to build on in order to avert the hostile application of biotechnology. How do we do that? Well, I hope that some ideas better than those that I can think of, or that all of us have thought of, will come along. But at present, here's what we have at our disposal. We have the taboo itself and the existing conventions, which very fortunately were created in the last few years. 1972, the Biological Weapons Convention, 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention, maybe just in the nick of time. What do they say? They basically say that one must not use biological agents, infective agents, chemicals for hostile purposes. So that's a very good bedrock to begin on. How do we implement it? Well, in a sense, these are self-executing to the extent that they set a guideline for state practice. But there are two ways in which states might violate or cross those lines. The one, of course, is what you could call gross breach, in which a country uses, let's say, lethal biological or chemical weapons against part of its own population or against another state. The other is kind of oozing over the boundary lines. There's great temptation to develop weapons that don't necessarily kill. And that is a temptation that is increasing these days, especially in my own country. The use of compounds that are centrally acting, influence behavior, make people more pliable. That's prohibited. It's absolutely prohibited, except for law enforcement, where there's existing law and applicable jurisdiction to enforce it, and not in contradiction with humanitarian law. Nevertheless, it isn't everybody who understands what those treaties say, and the great states have a way of reinterpreting things sometimes when they are stressed. So those are the two immediate dangers. To deal with those two things, primarily with the first kind of danger, of blatant violation, we need to have more transparency, and we need to have sanctions. We already have some transparency, but unfortunately it's in the hands of individual states. One state says, here's a list of countries which we claim are doing something. Well, how is the rest of the world to know whether this is correct? Even within the country, my own country, where these things are sometimes said. One part of our government says something, another part wonders if it's correct, because there has been no presentation of the evidence, no validation, no testing of it. So we need some better mechanism. And one way to do that is to use the triad of declaring facilities that might be used for wrong purposes, visiting those on a routine basis, routine inspections, and challenge inspection applicable not only to declared facilities but to any place, any time. This is exactly what the Chemical Weapons Convention is. It's working fine. It's better than could have been expected, I would say, increasingly better. So there's a model for it. Some people have said it cannot be applied to biological weapons. This, I think, it comes from making a wrong assumption. The wrong assumption is that treaties like that should be looked to increase the confidence of compliant states that everybody is abiding by the treaty. That's wrong. Compliant states should always be suspicious, always on their guard. The real purpose of such a treaty, if it's properly designed, is to undermine the confidence of those states who are contemplating non-compliance. That's the reason. It's just like speeding, although that's a rather homely analogy. But we know that most of the time when automobiles are going too fast on the highways, the police are not there to see it. There are just not enough squad cars and motorcycle police. Nevertheless, most people don't speed. Why? Because they know, and it's even become unconscious, built in, that if they do, at least in my country, their insurance premium will go up for 3 whole years by a very large amount if they get a ticket for speeding. And also they may be facing an angry man who, after all, has a gun right outside the window of their automobile. And it's a disgrace in a way, too. There's a moral, even though speeding is not the worst of crimes, there's a certain moral. So there's a case where there's very feeble detection capability. It should never give the police the confidence that nobody is speeding, and yet it deters. Why does it deter? Because there's a sanction at the end. And that's what is so far lacking. We don't have a sanction. We don't have an inspection regime. We need those two things. Now, coming to the subject of sanctions, what do you do if a state does something wrong? You could have a war. This is very costly, kills a lot of people, damages things, may make things worse. It's hard to say. Once war starts, as Winston Churchill said, it's very difficult to predict what might happen. You could have some kind of embargo. Usually this is ineffective and penalizes civilians and doesn't do very much. and even harms those who impose it and their allies. You could simply condemn a state publicly, which is essentially ineffective. And there are some other measures. But what about holding individuals responsible? A state is nothing but, in terms of its leadership, individual people. There is a body of international law called international criminal law. Since World War II, we have had 7 treaties to which the United States is party, Great Britain is party, which establish certain crimes as international crimes. These are airline hijacking, airline sabotage, taking of hostages, torture. We saw the case of Augusto Pinochet, a former head of state of Chile. A British court detained him and ruled that the request from Spain for extradition was valid and that the British courts had the jurisdiction to enforce that request. How is this possible? He's a man who is not a British subject. No one was accusing him of having committed torture on British territory. It's because of the 1984 Torture Convention, to which Great Britain and Spain are states parties. Works the same way for these other crimes: airline hijacking, airline sabotage, hostage taking, torture, theft of nuclear materials, crimes of maritime navigation, harming diplomats and other internationally protected persons while they're on active duty. Those are the 7 existing crimes, the nature of which is that jurisdiction is established in national courts. No international court is involved in this kind of law. In national courts, for anybody who is present on the territory of that nation, regardless of his nationality or where the crime, the alleged crime, was committed. That's the characteristic of these 7 treaties. You could have a new treaty that says that anybody who has stockpiled, produced, used chemical or biological weapons, or knowingly contributed to their development, production, stockpiling, or use, has committed a crime under international law. And then even if his activities or her activities are in complicity with the state where these are done, even in that case, they better not travel. Because if they go to a state that respects those conventions, or that convention, they run the liability of being put before a court. And so little by little, the world would become unsafe for individual government officials, individual greedy businessmen, individual evil professors, technical people. They would know that if they want to contribute to the manufacture or production or use of biological or chemical weapons, they'd better stay home if their country supports them. And if their government changes, even staying home will not protect them, because then they would possibly fall under the law of the new government. And even if the government with which they are complicit never changes and they don't travel, there's the possibility that under such law, as has happened, one can issue an indictment, not a conviction. That's not allowable. You cannot try people in absentia under such law, but you can indict them. And in that case, your friends, your children might say, let's say your son or daughter, "Father, we love you, but why are you an indicted international criminal?" So this won't deter everybody. It will deter businessmen quite a bit, because it will ruin them if they get caught. Probably it will deter most technical people. Will it deter bound and determined heads of state? It'll make it harder for them to get support from the other communities, and it will certainly provide an argument within councils of government when non-compliance is being considered as a possible option. But no, it certainly won't deter every conceivable ill-doer, but it certainly would add a great deal of sanction, much greater than what we have today. And the world is moving in that direction. As the world becomes more and more one world, one has to have law which is applicable to that world. You can't have, as the Wild West grew, it became more and more important to create law, legal systems, equitable systems. So putting all this together, there are new ways. Conventions that entail declarations, routine inspections and challenge inspection, penalties at the end for those who don't comply, especially penalties applicable to individuals, and the recognition that we're not talking about the security of any one state. We're talking about the human species here. That's the important thing to remember. This is not an ordinary security problem. If humanity drifts into the use of biotechnology as a means of expressing aggression, that's a total departure from all the old ways, which basically resemble a blow, whether it's hurling a bullet or a fist or a missile, an explosion. Nearly everything we do so far in expressing hostility is modeled on what we are designed to do biologically. We're not designed to poison. We're not designed to change the receptors in the brain. That's not how. There are some insects who do wage war with each other by modifying each other, either killing or modifying with chemicals that bind to receptors and alter behavior or kill. But that's not the way mammals have come along. And so what we're talking about is the possibility of a very fundamental and detrimental, even inimical change in the way human beings conduct themselves. That's why it rises above the security interests of any one state.